Welcome to the Octopus. Today, in front of a live audience at the KHM, the Academy of Media Arts in Cologne. Today's topic is techno-feminist pasts, presents, and potentials with our dear guest, Diana McCarty, or how you're also called, Dangerous McCarty. I've never heard that one before. Yeah, I'll do some bio stuff. You cut me or you take over if you think it's stupid. Diana is a media activist and the co-founder of the award-winning artists radio Reboot FM. You actually also have a frequency, like a FM frequency.
Yes.
In Berlin. In addition, she's a founding member of the radio stations Cotti FM, Radio FM, Cultural Radio Network, and the mailing lists Faces International Community, which is a community for women in media, and the NetTime mailing list. Her work revolves around art, gender, politics, radical feminism, and technology. As a cyberpunk in the 1990s, also a nice word, she was active in the emerging internet culture, with NetTime, Metaforum, and hackerspaces. Diana is very outspoken, neurotic, friendly, intelligent, and American. Or American. She has a sense of humor, is a little bit paranoid and extrovert. She drinks a lot, smokes like a chimney, and she cares about the environment. This is what Georgina Bruni in a Hot Gossip magazine interview in 1997. So I don't know if it's accurate. And they asked you, what's a nice girl like this doing hacking her way through cyber conferences? Her answer was spying for the American government mostly. So my first question is have you ever willingly or consciously or unwillingly and unconsciously, which you can't really answer then, spied for the US government or any other government?
No, I have not. Unconsciously, I'm going to go with yes. Not unconsciously, but unavoidably. Okay, so I will get to that, but no, I have not. Although that does pretty much refer directly to lots of suspicions and like my confession to a cyberpunk group that I worked with that was worried that I took too many notes during meetings. I must be honest and say I didn't take any notes. My Hungarian was terrible and I made lots of scribbled sketches. But I did confess to them on a public mailing list, like our internal mailing list, that I was in fact a spy. But for alien forces, my main mission on Earth was to make sure, that's a good thing to remember. My main mission here was to keep Earthlings out of outer space. And so it was a funny thing because basically I confessed like privately to somebody that I was in fact a spy, but I did it in a public forum. So for
the aliens who don't want humans to leave the planet.
Yeah, we're here to ensure that and my comment was that Earthling communication was clearly an indicator there was no big threat that Earthlings would colonize space.
Okay. Do you still think it's that way?
Yeah, I do actually. Okay. Yeah.
Continuing a little bit on the bio level, you're a Chicana from New Mexico. That's how you explain. You lived in Budapest for 10 years.
Yeah.
You're currently living in Berlin, like for 20 years already. You're sometimes, and I find it interesting because I did that too, you're perceived as a black woman. Can you explain how these moments play out? Yeah, in which contexts they happen sometimes, and in which context do you react on it, and in which context you just roll and let it go, or go with it?
I mean, I'm going to go with something. Is it like because I grew up in New Mexico, already as a kind of like majority minority, where you have a mixed culture of. I'm saying this because I guess Jonas will like have his own relationship to this, but you have a really strong native population, so Navajo, Comanche, Apache, Hopi, a lot of different Pueblo nations, Santo Domingo, lots, I think more than 18, each which speaks a different language. Then you have the Spanish colonial population, which my family came, like I say, we stole, we stayed 500 years ago. But it's also without mixing. Chicana is a more politicized way to avoid something like Hispanic. Like for my grandma, Chicana meant communist, which rides well with me anyhow. But it already means like when I started to go to art school, that there was a big rupture, big split between a white culture, sort of dominant white culture, and like minority cultures and whatever. And that way we always started forming bonds. But also I think like working as an outsider or like something like that within a sort of frame of culture, field of culture, created a certain type of communication. There as now, like I grew up mostly people always thought I was Black. Like, so I look like my dad's family. I don't look Mexican or Chicano. I look much more like my dad's family, my dad himself is white from the South, but they're from New Orleans and then they went to Mississippi. I don't look like his mom's family. I look like his dad's family. Anyhow, another story. But it's normal for me like to be confused with some kind of Afro-Latina or something. And of course it informs how I am and how I do things, because it's a kind of double outside position that I find useful to work with. So for me, it has given me like, one thing is I can say I carry with me a lot of privileges. Those are like privileges from a certain, like even as a perceived Black person, as a very light-skinned person, even within a brown culture, as a light-skinned person, as somebody with education and so on, without a whole lot of, let's say, money, but a lot of class privileges that aren't only tied to economy. So access to education. My family has been educated for centuries, so, and those were things. It's different when you're brought up with that knowledge. It's a kind of self-confidence. So I think I'd been brought up in a way that allowed me to operate from the margins, but engage with the center. And like, there's also coming from a very provincial place. Yeah. It was important to be able to engage, but on my own terms. And it's something to do with avoiding a mainstream. So like joining certain, like whatever underground scenes, but also with a very strong, like there's a very strong Chicano punk scene in Albuquerque that overlapped with other scenes. So, yeah. And I think, for example, in spring, I was in Dhaka at a meeting. It was a festival organized for African diaspora women. And it was Sabah Artistique. And Sabah is a kind of dance on Sunday for women, celebrating women in Senegalese culture. And it was organized really with no budget, almost totally independently by Rama Chow, who's a Dhaka-based filmmaker. She is like a kind of experimental documentary filmmaker, a fantastic woman. And we had to have a talk before I got my official invitation because, like, I think our communication when we'd met at festivals before that had been like, there's a, I guess, sensitivity, and that like how we dealt with like how certain types of racist things got played out in a nice festival. In that case, in particular, with the French Institute, and just certain things that are sometimes shocking but completely normal. Also in Germany, just certain things that happen on a daily and frequent basis, and that I also experience. So, and I can scale it up.
Can you give us an example?
Well, in that, okay, there she was just given, like, she and another white French filmmaker were guests of the French Institute. She was given a kind of cot in an office to sleep in. The white French artist was given a full studio accommodation with a little kitchen, a bed, like an actual bed, a sofa, a desk. So it was like this, like that, just something where it's kind of brutal, the disparities. The other things I think are like the sort of certain assumption. For example, I work with radio, and people always say, "Oh, do you work with multiculti?" Which and I'm just like, or a kind of assumption that I will like hip hop, and then these are real questions today that you're confronted with all the time. Yep. And so then it's like it doesn't make me mad. I have my, depending on the situation, because sometimes if you're dealing with very powerful people, you have to be polite. And that's like, so, and that's just something, sometimes you kind of have to eat it. So I have found my ways also to just like say, oh, hip hop, I've heard of that, but I actually prefer like noise. And that's just, which I don't, sometimes I do, but somehow it's like, at least, so it's like shifting the perspectives.
Yesterday, you also told me that it also happens in an artistic, like in a like a high cultural artistic environment, that you get perceived as a Black woman, and then sometimes you have to inform, and sometimes you don't. Can you quickly maybe give an example or tell us where you inform and where you don't, and why you don't?
I think, because it's like, here is something which, I mean, I can't really see you guys, so I can't tell like how you're responding to this, but I think Like, for example, because I had met Rama, we had a night to spend together before doing an event where she had informally invited me to join her event in Dhaka. And then I could understand why she had thought I would be like, and it's not because ethnically, I guess genetically, I will have some Black in me. That's not for me a question. So it's like finding a way to say, yes, I accept and embrace that, but I wasn't raised in a Black culture or with Black relatives. And in fact, all of my potentially Black relatives are not just not Black, they're super white. So super white elite Southerners. You know, I'm third generation Black sheep, which is even funnier because
what is that?
It's like the bad ones. So,
oh yeah, Black sheep. Okay,
yeah. So,
okay,
but I also think it's a double funny thing.
Yeah.
But in any case, yeah. So that for me, it's like, how do you establish especially because like in terms of what types of identities are cast on you and in which types of identities we perform, and that's something we all have. Like we all have different roles that we play, like whether and it's not in a fake way, just how the world sees you and how you choose to be seen and how much control you have. So I often don't have a lot of control over that. When it comes to somebody like Rama, for me, it was important for her to know that actually, of course, like for me genetically, no doubt, I have African heritage, but if she might not want to include me in an Afro-diasporic women's event based on these things. So I feel like then it's necessary to be honest. It's even had she not invited me, until that moment, I didn't realize how, like the assumption was made. And then, so I said to her, that's it. And she said, well, okay, great. You should come anyway. I went. It was a fantastic meeting. It was really great. But that's, for example, that like, I have also been done talks with Grada Kilomba, who's quite well known. I think she wrote Plantation Memories, like episodes of Everyday Racism. She's done a lot of film work. We've done film work together. We've done several public discussions. And then I think it's necessary that then I will identify myself as like a Chicana, more importantly. And it's something that I didn't feel necessary years ago. It wasn't private, but it didn't, like in a European context, Mexican was just fine. And that's like, I can also say mixed, but it's because I don't want to go into my whole lineage. Like, when is that relevant? I grew up in a much more firmly rooted in my New Mexican heritage and visited Mississippi only rarely. It's always weird. So, but there it does inform how I do things. And I would just say that it's something where I was just working with some students in Utrecht, and one of the women asked me how it informed how I work with people. And it definitely, she asked how I work with inclusive social practices. And I can say that has been a giant bonus in terms of working with social inclusion and understanding what it means, like how you deal with difference in commonality and how those lines get drawn. Because once you've been invited as somebody, like someone will say to you, oh, we would like to have people of color involved or whatever. And it's like, well, fuck you. I cannot help you with your needs to have difference. And I'm not pleased to be invited to perform that role for you. And that's something so figuring out how do you deal with inclusion, if you come from a sort of marginalized place, it's different because you can already anticipate certain types of practices or like terms of participation that would be more interesting and more fair.
Do you think it makes sense to fuck around in an affirmative way with this? Because once you described yourself in the Hot Gossip magazine in 1997, you said that you want to actually become an Eastern European male. So how about becoming Eastern European male? At the time, this was really important also to contextualize. In the 1990s, the internet and the cyberpunk movement or cyberfeminism movement, which we're going to soon talk about, basically the internet gave everybody the opportunity to work with identity, to work out their own identity issues, to experience multiple identities, to experiment around there. And I'm not sure if that is still something that is going on today. I know that we did that at the time, and you did that obviously. But do you think you could use that today to use yourself to affirm the for example, you're in this sense for you culturally not relevant blackness, and put that in front and create like an or an artificial persona that could then play around with these kind of identity politics?
I mean, I think that's possible, and there certainly, I'm pretty sure that interview is still. I have to say that interview was. I mean, you know this, but
yeah, you just told me, but I use it for the whole
the
whole question set. But it's a fake interview.
Yeah, but it was a net art piece, and
it's perfect.
It was it's a great thing, and I use the interview a lot myself, so because I kind of forget about that. But yeah, this. Of course, I think that would have been snarky humor even then. From my side, it would have been an understanding of something. And maybe I said that over drinks, which, I might have said that at one point. But I think for me, what's kind of like if it goes to identity, I'm not particularly interested in identity, but I am interested in toppling white supremacy. And for that, I think it needs to have a lot of race and class and gendered positions that are not only in opposition, but are kind of affirmed in different directions. And that's something that are even affirmed, maybe that are just active in different directions. And that's the right way to counter a sort of right-wing, neo-Nazi, white supremacist, regressive, totally regressive, but yet very powerful moment. They are going for what they think they know, and the most basic thing of distillation, making really bad vodka. That's the right wing model, is to go with everything that you could imagine that and then just really getting down to the most basic raw things. And it's just super regressive. It's against any it's so anti-affirming of life. And I think the right approach to counter that would be kind of ignore them and create other worlds that can be lived in with complete weirdness and abandon and happiness.
We have to move into the techno-feminist area now, because we are actually. Because one of the most important things that sprang up for me was that you mentioned quality of life. Mm-hmm. The problem is, that's why I asked you this kind of question, whether today do you think, in terms of, on the one side, the identity politics we have today, and on the other side, or we exercise or experiment with today, or theorize as well, but on the other side, we have methodologies that worked in the 90s, in the 0 years, that don't work anymore. Mm-hmm, for example, affirmation. Mm-hmm. Because affirmation is being occupied as a technique by the alt-right, by the neo-fascists tendencies, not only by people, but by systems as well. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work anymore. But that's the other aspect, is this quality of life sentence, which was in the description, was the most interesting part, because if I understand it right, the work you do, and that's why your work is so relevant, is that you are working with socio-organizational models. Depending, we're gonna put back the radio stuff. We're gonna discuss it a little bit later, but it's also part of that. So looking at the mailing list in the 90s, which is an organizational format, and it's not so much, as you stated, it's not so much for you about the theory, but it's more about the system that you build. Yeah, that was not really a question, but more a statement. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about these socio-organizational models, and then you could tell us a bit about your research you're doing now on techno-feminist past, presence, and prospects.
Because the cool thing is that one thing, and it's I started doing stuff when I was really young, like a teenager. I started participating in weird things and doing things and kind of understanding how I want to engage with culture. And also going to really shitty at-risk youth programs. So I'm okay. And then when I saw Sans Soleil, and when I was finally a student, I was man, I didn't know stuff like this was out there. So I was that's the world I want to be in. And I started to participate and organize in whatever, sometimes student congresses, Mecha, Movimiento, Chicano student movement conferences. They were great, but also still very much in line with what an academic conference should be. So I started to think about forms, and I also just thought about what's interesting for me. Okay, and then what's interesting for the guests. By the way, it's a very basic thing. And it in New Mexico, just because the friends I had then, two really good old friends of mine are both now teaching at UNM. Shauna Sunrise is now teaching native indigenous media. It's a new job. And Moises Gonzalez is a buddy, and he's doing architecture. Like he's a professor of architecture now. But the way we started to work and engage with high level culture, and it's somehow how I've carried on. And it's like asking other people, what do you think? The conferences that we did in Budapest, for example, was like having, I don't know, this many people and asking you guys like that might be cyberpunks or potentially like doing CD-ROM magazines in the 90s. Remember, this is like before internet's really a thing. Like talking to all the people that might be interested and figuring out what they would like us to cover. And then having a conference where you have a few speakers, but they're also speaking to each other. And it's bringing in theory and practices, but it's like the whole target audience is already people that could almost be on the panel. And then having lots of space for them to talk, because it's like building culture. And it's something where you want to make sure that it's not networking. It's like, okay, we need to exchange ideas and do stuff. And I think this was something that it was important because we always, like, even if we use some basic formal structures, the operations around it were always much more informal and allowing for that, like giving it some topics and some points of reference, and then making sure that all the people that should be in those that should be involved and that was there. Like we would, I don't know, sometimes like in Budapest, this was like early 90s, we did some of the first internet stuff there. We had the first public internet thing. It didn't really work. The second one also didn't work, and a Dutch guy almost had a nervous breakdown. It was really embarrassing because he was a grown man, and he really, like this, I mean, it's like 95, that someone would expect that the internet was working perfectly, that they could present a website. I mean, I'm sorry, it still never works. So, but he really, like, he didn't have any other way to present his work. And he really did have a kind of emotional crisis. So I'm not saying I shouldn't talk about that all the time. It's mean. But anyhow, it's weird because it was like we were able to deal with it. Our internet did not really work. That's the point. But the things around it did, and the conversations and the drives. So the people were great. And it was like we really did like north-south, like a lot of Italians and like sort of Dutch, like models comparing how like internet cultures were working, and east-west. And we didn't have loads of money. We had actually very little, but we were able to pay for people to come from like surrounding countries, and not to do anything other than join the conference. And conferences don't usually do that. So it was more like gatherings and stuff like, and something like that. So I think the forms were important because it wasn't just like, it wasn't importing knowledge from elsewhere in order to educate anybody. It was always like they were kind of, like people say convened a lot now, and I like this. They were much more, and they were already doing that. We were convening people, and it kind of, in order to simply share and be more like happily engaged with the work we were doing. So, yeah.
And so that was, okay, let's stay there. I remember the time of the Old Boys Network.
Yeah.
I remember cyberfeminism conferences.
Yeah.
Some of them were very, very heavily dominated, for example, by German women.
Yeah.
But then there were counterpoints like VNS Matrix from Australia.
Yeah.
So you were part of this movement. And how do you, and tell us a little bit about it, because I think not a lot of people know about this.
Good. I can say, like, it's funny because, yes, like VNS Matrix, I met on the internet, and they were so cool because then I was already a feminist. In East Europe, a lot of women were not really keen on feminists. For them, that was another sort of Western, like, form of colonization of the East. And I was like, I don't care. Feminism, I don't need the word. I just do it. It's something to do rather than be. So, but VNS Matrix were very cool, and I liked them. We translated the Cyborg Manifesto from Haraway into Hungarian. And this, I must say, like, I want to get a copy of that and translate it back, because I'm sure that my understanding of that then, like, even how I read Haraway then versus how I read it 10 years ago or how I read it now, I'm just like, man, that would be just hilarious. So anyhow, like, I'm just like, wow, we did that. So, but VNS Matrix are very cool. They were cool, but they also come from a different place. And this is, what's interesting is, like, Haraway wrote, I think, the Cyborg Manifesto in like 84, 85. I mean, it's published a few years later, so it was circulating. That's before the fall of the wall. That's when the internet is still barely a thing. There are some dial-up modems at home, and people are hanging out in text-based environments. which become more and more the thing. So people start to have email. The main interface that people used are text-based environments, which is where like VNS Matrix located their cyberfeminist manifesto. And that's something it's important to realize that whole generation of like feminist action, that their understanding of Big Daddy mainframe was so prescient. It was really like, I don't know what that word is on my head today, so on my mind, that the how they were describing the engagement of technology with our daily lives was before anything smart. And I think it's important because then you have like in the 91, the VNS Matrix thing comes out, which is already, again, it's like post 89, post like massive changes. Even if they're writing from their like located in Australia, they are engaging with the world through these nets and really participating in global change. And then you have this other kind of whatever techno euphoric thing where like, which is sort of where I enter the internet culture. Like my first internet experiences are really in Budapest. Even though like I was informed that the internet existed and I should use it already by one of my actually close buddies in Albuquerque, who was actually, she was the president of Mecha. So and she was like, "Oh, Diana, you have to do this." But anyhow, I was like, "Computers, no thanks." But anyhow,
what did VNS do at the time? What was the cool thing? I mean, they were sitting in Australia. They were doing. They were traveling. They were traveling.
They were already working as artists. They were already like single moms. The interesting thing is that they had politics.
Yeah.
So they had politics that they brought to the net, and then they started to formally critique how the like operations of disembodiment and embodiment worked in relation to the internet. I think already pointing out how power structures that were meant to be escaped in these kind of text-based fantasy worlds were still at play. But they went maximum overdrive there. And so they went on like We Are the like Future Cunt, all of these things, bringing their like slime politics into that pure space of these text worlds. So they came in with something radical. Okay. And they radically interfered with those zones. So they also were very, very active in text-based environments, but with their kind of slimy, slutty politics.
But they were already grown people with politics, with children.
Yeah.
They were basically, they had a position.
Yeah.
I'm just asking because the people who were designing the internet in the 90s and until now are the opposite.
Yeah.
They don't have politics.
Right.
They don't have a position.
Right.
They're very, very undereducated. So this is an interesting
and I can say also that they weren't particularly elite. So this is like really young single moms. Like, so it's something that informs. It's important because it does inform how they arrived at what they do.
So what is so VNS is this one? They were really punk in a way.
Yeah.
They were really digital punk feminists.
Yeah.
And really cool. I never knew what they did, but we thought, because we were doing the basically the male model at the time with the 7 basically post-puberty guys. And actually there is a picture of us with VNS Matrix in a toilet somewhere at the, I think the Ars Electronica.
That was
that was really, but we didn't understand what they were doing, and I'm not sure if they understood what we were doing. But it was obvious that they're really cool.
You guys were performing Big Daddy Mainframe.
What the fuck is that?
You guys were performing the masculine white supremacist power of the internet.
Exactly.
That's Big Daddy Mainframe.
Exactly.
So that's you guys were. This is. I didn't realize that either at the time.
Everybody hated us for that because we were portraying the corporate fascism, and we were embodying it in an emotional way as well, because we understood that it's happening, but we couldn't formulate it. It was more like an intuitive thing. But going back to. So VNS Matrix, and then we have this, and I never really understood because it was not my place to be part of. Old Boys Network and the cyber feminist conferences. So what happened there? What was the functions? What were the topics? And how was the work being done?
Okay.
And how does the quality of life play into that?
Yeah. Well, here's something very interesting because this is like the first wave of internet bubble stuff. There's money. There's actually, compared to today, quite a lot of money. People are sort of suddenly curious about what's happening with the internet. The World Wide Web has been launched. So this is like already 94 is when the World Wide Web starts to be a thing. So that the Old Boys Network comes about in 1997, okay, which is like Faces started just before that. which was basically like running net time, which was really like a very male dominated zone. But I thought, like with Kathy Ray Huffman and Vali Georgievich, we thought, okay, let's start a mailing list for like women. I was hoping that women would use it more discursively. And I asked a few women like why they didn't post more on net time. And they were like, I only write text when I get paid. By the way, this is a small important point. They did not participate in what was then called the gift economy. They also did not make careers, okay? Ted Byfield, Brian Holmes, they made their careers, their names out of net time. Many other people, like it wasn't that they didn't do anything, but they really used this free platform to, they were very generous with sharing their ideas. I don't want to criticize that too much, but they were they were really able to capitalize on that in real ways that meant jobs and money and income. And this is something that women were not participating in on any kind of similar level and did not benefit from on any kind of similar level. So that's a kind of interesting thing. Now, in 97, basically NetTime was invited to organize the hybrid workspace at Documenta. And Innen was an art group, a German art group that were doing, do you remember Innen? They were they did some quite cool projects, and it was a collective of women. And they did certain things. They would go to these kind of massive corporate commercial computer fairs and then hand out, like, I don't know, they would hand out questionnaires on like prostitution. And they did actually do a quite interesting few projects. There's almost no documentation of them. Innen had dissolved and was invited to take up one of the slots at the hybrid workspace. In retrospect, I think Faces should have been invited to do that, but whatever. So that's like internal, like now it's really gossipy. We'll have to cut this out. My ex-partner and my other colleague were invited to do this. And it was like, oh, we can't have girlfriends in. And I was like, I was totally on board with this. But in retrospect, it was a terrible idea from my side. I should have demanded to be part of the whole thing. But
can we make a quick deviation? Because this is a topic I wanted to talk about anyway, is because the NetTime mailing list is for the digital art and culture scene, is like used to be the authoritative platform where theory, cultural theory, art theory, techno politics was being handled and negotiated, basically. And it was basically occupied by men. You founded it together with your boyfriend, Pitt Lovink. The credit for the NetTime mailing list, which is still ongoing, and it is a pillar in the technopolitical historical art world. You're not credited. There is another example is called Nervous Systems, Quantified Life and the Social Question at the HKW in Berlin. You initiated this exhibition, and I researched it this morning, and there is not one mention of your name. Now, this is normal. We know that. This is how it works, right? My problem also with dealing with your person in terms of as an artist or a media person, I wouldn't even know how to describe you. Yeah, and my question goes in this direction, is because you cannot be grasped. You don't put yourself into a box. There is no genre. Yeah, you do so many different things, and they are not. You cannot capitalize directly.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with this complex, or maybe also for the audience, what kind of suggestions would you give today how to deal with this?
This is actually something
that hasn't changed.
It's also something when I look at like how you work with groups and collectives. It's one thing where I would say, and I honestly like this is something where for me, like doing Metaform and NetTime, I felt very happy and confident because I was in a decision-making role. I did a lot of the work. I wasn't as core to the project as Hert and Pitt, but I was still one of the founders. I was one of a short-lived moderation thing. And I was also part of what brought in the thing that we should, for social reasons, it would be better to change moderators. But in any case, I'm not too worried about that, but I was actively engaged in my own like bad situation. And one thing is that I think it's important to, like, it's always hard. And I particularly like to women or to like, I can say those that are like less part of the dominant culture are less likely to benefit in the end, right? Less likely to get jobs. I was like, check, just make sure everybody gets the same credits, make sure everybody gets the same pay, and this is something, especially in collective work, it's often, it's really often that people do get left out, and there are all kinds of essential things like helpers and so on. And like there with NetTime, I was actively participating in a system that was not really in my interest. Although, like, for example, with Metaforum, I'm always fully credited. With Janosch, it was always different. With NetTime, and that was like, I also kind of wanted to pull back because of this private relationship that I had then. And interestingly enough, like with Nervous Systems, like they're the credits that I should have gotten, like with NetArt or something, like they're a whole field of stuff. I'm not too worried about, because the people that I care about know, and they're actually kind of inhabiting really good positions now. So I have a lot of friends in powerful places like you, but then it's like that sort of works out, and I'm better able to manage those now and bring something else to the table. Nervous Systems, I can tell you, like with HKW, it's fine. But I took the money more than the credits because I worked for a small NGO and they wanted to do something. I brought this thing in. I think on some parts of HKW website, they corrected this, but they also, like, I took the money rather than the credits. I can say that was...
But how to deal with this is not necessarily a gender thing. It's, for me, is a question of, if you do interesting stuff today, contemporary stuff, you will is not able to define it because it makes no sense. The moment you can put it in a box, it's already passed.
What?
So the really interesting stuff cannot be packaged. It cannot be labeled. But, and their gender kicks in, guys, a tendency, guys rather just slap the label artist or theoretician or something on top, and then formalize it down, boil it down a little bit, make it communicatable, and then the career rather goes off in competition to people who are much more focused on the inner workings of the stuff, or don't give a shit about the communication. And that is not, and again, I don't have a moral problem with it. It's not the point. It's a question of quality. So maybe we should also make the jump now. So Old Boys Network, VNS Matrix, cyberfeminism in the 1990s. What has survived? What has survived and until today, and how does it look today? Now, maybe you can tell us about the research you're doing for the present.
Here is something where I would say there was something. What's kind of interesting there, like this segue, is that, like, that Old Boys, and this is also, I think it's kind of funny gossip, and that's what happens if you get too old. You just know stories. You know where the skeletons are. So, Old Boys Network did not exist before they had the invitation to do something at the hybrid workspace. And there was, within this kind of Netzkultur, like politically, like it never even had a real proper English version, so just Netzkultur. Within that, there was no active kind of feminist group. So Faces would have done that, but we weren't even actively feminist because there was such a strong engagement and participation with women in East Europe. And that was just whatever. So we supported the OBN participation, which became OBN. There was Vali Georgievich was also one of the founders of OBN, and they did their events. But they only came to exist because they had an invitation that involved a kind of participation in Documenta. There was a certain amount of money attached to it, a certain amount of visibility, and so on, which is funny. And so I can say, like, for example, the 100 and whatever antithesis, I was there. I was part of the group that said, okay, let's do this as a fun, internal, get to know each other experiment. That becomes the main thing that they produced is, for me, kind of embarrassing, because there were three readers produced. And there were some interesting things, but it never became a movement, and there was never any kind of real practice associated with it. And I would say the following events, it had this. I mean, I say white ladies with laptops. And it's not that they didn't have access to a lot of other people and, like, theory, practices, ideas. They just weren't able to deal with them. So a lot of the later meetings just kind of ended with, I think, really deep divisions where there were a lot of resentment and a lot of, I think, just things that were not discussed that went wrong. Anyhow, it doesn't really matter. I think it kind of disappeared. There has been a rebirth, and a lot of people are doing PhDs around cyberfeminism. There's xenofeminism, which, funnily enough, some of the OBN people criticize as being the female manifestation of the accelerationists, which I think is sort of funny because I think there is a certain parallel there, that you have a very masculine theoretical culture that also kind of needs its own feminist branch. But I can't say that the acceleration has provided any resources for that to happen. But it's just funny because I think there's a certain amount of jealousy, like towards attention. And there are an awful lot. When I say awful lot, I just mean a whole lot. I don't mean, well, maybe it's awful. A lot of people doing PhDs around cyberfeminism, xenofeminism, and techno-feminism. And I have decided that I should participate in that a little bit rather than just complaining. And also just like being the person, the old lady with all the skeletons. So I want to bring those skeletons to life. And there, like I've done this, there was a panel at ICA 2 years ago. And I think that was a productive start. They left out all of East Europe. So it engaged with, like, I think a lot of like politics of race that are happening online in a very productive way. But I think it's necessary to not give up territory. And East Europe was very much a part of the mid-90s cyberfeminism. So like I do a lot, I still stay in touch with Alla Mitrofanova. Like I'm doing a lot of stuff with her. The research I'm doing now actually does connect to this like techno-feminist past, presence, and potentials, because I got asked, I did a talk at Cream Cake in Berlin, it was a queer cyber-feminist event. And I did something which is, I mean, it was a talk I gave here last year, connecting like Bolshevik bank robbering women to other like political threads, like Elena Stasso. I will give you that in a second. Anyhow, I will give you the reason why the question was asked. One of the public at this cream cake event, where nearly everybody was very young and doing academic PhDs. Okay, so this was something like, and when I say young, I do mean like, I think early 20s to 30. So it's like a lot of quite young and very academic. And I think I was one of the only people that's not an academic that was speaking. One of the audience members asked me how I am able to make the connections I make. And actually, in keeping with the first interview, I said I drink a lot and hang out with my friends. And it's true, but it's not like it's unproductive. And this is something where, for me, part of being a radical feminist is that you don't follow the rules. And it's a part of even like what I would say, like with forms and aesthetics, is that how you share knowledge, how we do what we do, the forms it takes informs how we take it in. So even like doing this discussion here, like instead of just having a lecture or a presentation, how we engage with what we know, how we share it, how we do it, like how we do what we do. And so this, like in the last couple of years, I started linking up, like I researched with a friend of mine, Franziska Kleiner in Berlin. She's also Telekommunistin. We've written a screenplay about a Bolshevik bank robbery in 1907. And we tell it from the perspective of 3 teenage girls who were involved. And so we've done a lot, like we know as much as any Georgian who knows about this bank robbery. We're quite experts. It's an forbidden topic. So it's not taught in the access to information in public state libraries in Georgia. It's off limits because of construction, like for years. Like that stuff is just, probably it will get ruined in the construction process. So this story that we tell, we've gotten like loads of things. So we know, for example, that they were inspired by Harriet Tubman. We also know that they ran illegal printing presses. They were students. We know a lot about who these girls had to have been. There are 3 historical examples with names, but there were more. They were teenagers. They came out of Guria, and that's how Georgians know it was from the names. They are Western Georgians. The Gurian Republic was between 1902 and 1906, and it partly sparked the Russian Revolution, the failed one of 1905. Okay. They had all of these things where the women were participating in local peasant councils. So the women were very strong and a part of this peasant-led socialist state, which is the first independent state in the world that was socialist. And it got brutally cracked down by the czars. These girls took up arms, they assassinated people, and they robbed banks. So they also carried grenades in their petticoats. For example, Ekaterina, who was the wife of Stalin, she's often portrayed in history as this kind of dumb, meek follower of him. Her whole family were committed Bolsheviks and revolutionaries. Her parents, her sisters, they ran a very fancy dress shop in Tbilisi. And so the idea that historically she's lost all of her agency. And so these are things, well, we just found this out. Our screenplay, we're finishing, we're trying to sell it. We want Netflix to make it. Like, we don't want to make it. We need to blow up some stuff and a camel or 2. We need some camels and explosions. It's not an art film. It's not an essay film. No. But for example, we uncovered all these sort of histories that not so many people know about. And for example, like Elena Stasova, who we call Lenin's Lady Laptop, she was the center. So she was part of this extremely secret underground operations, which later becomes the center in the Soviet Union. She was the leader of that. She was known for never writing anything down. She was the head of encryption and decryption of all Bolshevik secrets. She knew where all the money was. She was like the chief financial officer. She knew where all the safe houses were, everybody's nicknames, et cetera, et cetera. She moves to Tiflis just as our girls are becoming kind of radical. There isn't much heard about them afterwards, and we think it's because she was an effective teacher. So like Franziska and I have written this screenplay, we have to leave out a lot of details. So I use things because we don't focus too much on Elena Stasova, but it's still a fascinating story that she's like this extremely important figure. She also, she was very influential for Kollontai, who becomes this Minister of Women's Health and Education, I think, Minister of Women and Family in the Soviet Union. Kollontai is a much more well-known figure. Stasova is the one who trained her how to be a political organizer. So it's like all of these sort of unknown stories. And so basically, I work as well with Filipa Cesar, who is a filmmaker, Portuguese filmmaker based in Berlin. And we do a lot of experimental texting. And I help her with her films. I'm her cosmic advisor. So we work together writing and also finding new linguistic formats to share information. So, and also going through film footage. And she's done a lot of work with militant filmmakers from Guinea-Bissau. There's a small mediatheque being built up there, which hopefully in the future we can plan excursions there. So it's to build up film and video. And again, with her, I find out all kinds of, there's a lot of stuff that comes out of the shared work. So now with my research, I'm basically making a computer game with communist games developers where I take all of these different figures over history. And basically it's sort of what leads up to what becomes Donna Haraway. So I'm looking at what happens before the 90s. There's so many publications around techno-feminism that come after the 90s. You don't have to read any of them. I suggest just read Haraway. You don't need to know what, I'm sorry, I really suggest that just spend time with Haraway if you're going to spend your time reading stuff. There's and maybe read Laboria Kubonek's with the Manifesto for a Politics of Alienation. That's worth reading, But don't worry about the rest of it at all. It's just boring. It's really badly written. It's you don't need to fulfill those you don't need to make their PhDs worth more than they are, right? And it's Haraway. It sort of ends with Haraway. Okay, in Venus Matrix, fine. But that looking at what leads, because what Haraway drives from is basically liberation struggles and cybernetics. Mm-hmm. So and now I have to go back one little thing. A computer game. Alexander Bogdanov wrote Red Star. Mm-hmm. Now he's and he is one of the guys supplying the grenades for our bank robbery in 1907. In 1908, he publishes Red Star, which is the first socialist utopian science fiction novel. And it's basically Mars is a socialist utopia planet. And there's some aliens, a Russian revolutionaries traveling to Mars and seeing things. And it's his reflections. This, of course, it was shocking for me to find out that my grenade guy was also a science fiction writer. He also wrote essays on technology. He was an agronomist and very interested in organizational science. And he's super interesting. Red Star, everyone should read. So I'm working in Utrecht, our work group. We are reading everything with Red Star because then we can use it as a space. We use it as space travel and time travel. So we use the Red Star thing as a way to revisit revolutionary moments. I am taking up the ones of feminist militants, and I start with the Haitian Revolution, which Sanité Belair is one of the women that took up arms to fight French oppression and colonization. I mean, colonization is something else, but she was one of the enslaved Africans there that fought for her freedom. She took up arms, and she was executed for this. She was a general or a lieutenant, but they say that she refused to have her eyes covered when she was hanged. And of course, word of this traveled Port-au-Prince to New Orleans. New Orleans in the U.S. was French-speaking then, and it was actually the first refugee crisis in the U.S. Whites fleeing Haiti, so they went to the U.S. But of course, newspapers published stuff like this. It took a bit longer, but Harriet Tubman would have heard about Sanité Belair. But of course, I like to imagine all of these tables from New Orleans up until Maryland, refugees coming, oh my God, how was it? They took up arms, oh my God. And eating their soup. Meanwhile, slaves are running around serving the food and also hearing the story through ship workers and dock workers, which is one thing is that's how information traveled then. Mm. And that's how, that's up until the internet. That was how, even Lech Wałęsa, the ship workers and railroad workers have historically always been not just unionized, but really well informed.
So that's why Solidarność was very powerful, or very well organized and communicating well.
And so what I look for is the hidden aspects of gender in this. Now, of course, Norbert Wiener, apparently, Alexei, who's one of my colleagues now, has a line that can prove that Norbert Wiener had read not just Red Star, but Bogdanov's other writings, and then basically used them to found cybernetics, which he also realized in Latin America. And so, for example, something like the Chilean project CyberSyn is it was my feeling, it's clearly relates to the Red Star. And anybody who knows both can see the relationship. Now I'm looking for the hidden ladies there. And I found out that Salvador Allende's wife was a teacher of geography and history, but then she later worked in the Office of Statistics of the government of Chile. And that's exactly what Red Star does. So it deals with what the science of CyberSyn does, is it deals with statistics and how to translate those into more effective operating systems for society. So, and it's like having the internet, but in the interest of the public good and not for profit. So, and that's, so now it's and cybernetics and liberation movements are where Donna Haraway gets her thing, plus a feminist critique of science. So then it's and those are part of these things. So I sort of look at what builds up to Donna Haraway. And
this is brilliant.
So, yeah.
This has been a wonderful example of the way you work, I think, also to show us, to give us a kind of non-linear, very networked way of thinking. And there may be a question, because I believe that the visualization or the and this is going to be next week, we're going to have in the seminar, we're going to do network graphs and the visualizations of networks. And I believe that the way the metaphors that we choose are actually compromising or in a positive way influencing the way we think about things. So it's super interesting to hear you talk on these various levels of information and history, and then kind of feeding back or bouncing back to always coming back to Haraway as this kind of a foundational point, and always looking for the ladies in the stories. These are just parameters, but basically you're using kind of network structure. How does your brain look like when you work like that? You say you drink a lot. Do you take other drugs or do you? No, that's that. But
I just drink wine. It doesn't even really count. I've had
that's just a baseline.
Cigarettes, chocolate, coffee. Yeah.
How do you think your reality looks like, or your brain looks like when you work?
Happy.
It's happiness. It's just happiness and curiosity. Are you curiosity driven, or what is your motivation to do that?
Here's one thing, and it's even for all of you, one of the things, and it's kind of bears on the discussion you were having yesterday, is that one thing is, I think, at the end of the day, you don't want to, if you want to just get a job and have a kind of whatever stable, if maybe that's not even boring existence, why not do that? There are all kinds of ways to be in the world, being a decent human being, having, enough to eat, enough to live and send your kids to school, whatever, if you want to have kids. And then the thing is, if you want to work in art and culture, I think you want the work to mean something. And I think that's sort of the drive, and to have it be meaningful for someone else. And whatever that is, experience. I'm less interested in pedagogy. I'm more interested in I think contaminating people with curiosity. And that's something that people could do what they want with the information or their own curiosity. So driving that, which interesting, I kind of think that the sort of mainstream internet world that we live in with the smart devices is it curiosity killer because it's the feeling is that everything is at your fingertips? But I also would urge people to all consider like your own like working conditions so that you're able to actually HKV is the nervous systems. I'm not like with HKV, it's great. I kind of accepted that situation because I needed the money more than I needed the headache of getting the credits from the place where I worked, which was not HKV. With HKV, I can always come to them with projects, and they are until now a very good supporter of the radio, very influential, and they're doing very good things. So like for me, it was more important to preserve that relationship than cause like a scandal and get the credits that I needed. So, and they were not responsible. I must say that was not HKV. So, but it's like they were extremely generous and good about the whole thing. But I would urge people to be more cautious with that, and especially because at some point you want to work with groups, but to make the sort of working conditions are important. And figuring out, like, sometimes it is more important to take the money and run. Like, that is sometimes, like, I would, prefer not to, but sometimes sometimes you just need to get paid and you don't need to worry too much about credits. It's like sometimes that's more your interest. So
you're a really good friend, personal friend with Hito Steyr.
Yes.
How does she do it? I mean, she's one of the most influential artists in the world right now. How does she manage to do that? Does she have fun doing what she does? Is she happy? I mean, for me, this is a relevant question because you are doing hyper interesting stuff, and you say, I just want to be happy. I need to be satisfied, or I just want to be happy, and sometimes drunk or something. That's what drives me, and then I can make my own decisions. So I just want to take the money. Do I want to fight for the credits? Am I going to be pissed about things that happened 30 years ago, or am I just going to use it today and analyze situations and consult people or change my own behavior? This is agency for me. This is autonomy for me as a person. It doesn't matter gender or where you come from. Yeah.
I mean, this, okay, like I'm not going to get too personal.
No, that's not the question.
Yeah, I do. I like, for me, okay, it's also important to be, the huge luxury of my life is I don't have to put up with too many boring assholes. And that's really like, and I really think, no, that's important. And like, for example, when I had a job, that was just part of the whole thing. And it was just awful to have coffee with really like boring apolitical people, just even at the coffee thing. And I was like, oh my, I'm getting paid for this. That's okay, fine. But I was like, oh my God, this is what it's like to have a job. And, I've had the great luxury of mostly having like doing independent projects and like having a very like, in retrospect, quite like living at certain levels of poverty that I was like, oh, that's what you call it. But also having a really good quality of life. So I would still really encourage people to set a slightly higher bar on your relationship to poverty. But the other thing is that it's like, I mean, I can say I had a crisis like a couple of years ago because I was like, oh, it doesn't make sense. I'm like, well, it's all media. It's like I work with film, internet, radio, and I was like, well, so that's it. It's media. And then I'm a feminist. Why not be a techno? And I put the dash in between. It means there are two separate things that I bring together. It's not one thing. You have to explain the dash. Hito had a similar crisis some years ago that she didn't feel like her work was making sense. And she wasn't, I mean, I can say, she didn't have the easiest of times. Like she wasn't like financially, it wasn't easy for her to get by. And that, like before she got the professorship, which took her students striking, it took a long time to get that position cleared up with the university. It wasn't that easy. And it's like, plus she's not a very easy person. So she's always been very, I think, conscious of all kinds of like these working conditions. And on the one hand, being fair, trying to be fair to herself, kind of good with what compromises she had to make and being very, being very compromising. So, and so, that I can say it took her a long time, but it did pay off. And I think that's paid off because she kind of got lucky with eFlux that worked out so well, because if you read texts before she started publishing there, they're really dry. And I think one of the things is that she tried very hard to write in a sort of academically acceptable way. And once she broke free from that, it's really, once she found found her own way of doing things, her own way of writing and doing things, I think that was part of what made her successful. And like, this is the thing that I think, this is what I kind of help people with, is helping them find their own voice. And that now I can find my own voice because I'm like, oh, I could just do it for myself. But this is also this, like we were talking about this, when students are always sort of like young artists pressured to always have your own discourse accompanying your work and like all of like fulfill all of these boxes. And it's already like kind of production killing, creativity killing. And like, I'm not speaking for like the individual, like, oh, you're like, oh, like, you know, this creative individual is being boxed in. But I don't think that, I don't think having all the answers, I don't think the best work, I don't think you have to know all the answers for it to be good. And I think sometimes you only find out later what was important about the work.
Yeah, we talked about that. Yeah. That was I think for me, it was also an important understanding how much freedom you give away when you have to define everything, when you have to explain everything, when everything has to make sense. And that also leads me to another level. That's maybe my second last question. Because we talked about language transformation, which plays into this cluster that is today for young artists today. I think it's quite a burden because you are demanded from you is required that you completely understand art history. You have to be fluent in theory. You have to be safe in theory because people don't understand if you haven't read Haraway or Latour or whatever.
Or God forbid, or Adorno, and then
is who are you? What kind of subhuman animal are you? So you have this huge pressure, and because you cannot use affirmation anymore, like we did it, I would just stand there and say, I'm a white male idiot, and I'm an alcoholic, by the way. That would just release me of so much fucking tension and justification. So these layers of justification come. Then you have to explain your work. Your work has to function. It doesn't. But that's what is required because and you have to, as an artist, you have to live. That's why I asked the question. I'm also nosy, but that the Hito question was about that. Today, as an artist, you have to function on a political, economical, marketing fucked upness. So you also have to be a drug addict and super fucked up 4 o'clock in the morning in some weird fucking parties. So you have to be and you have to do logistics. You have to be an HR person. You have to do everything. And then on top of that, now we have this language discourse, which is super relevant because language designs reality, and reality is how we design is how we design our environment. But the problem is what I see, and we kick back to the new fascism and alt-right and white supremacy people. Yeah, opportunistic people have started to work with contradictions. They embrace contradictions. I already said it, right? They don't give a shit about where the concepts or ideas, what the origins are, or whether they apply here, or whether it's correct or not. And maybe my question to you is, how do you talk with activists or artists and intellectuals? What is your language, and what is your approach, and what is your mental setup to do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's because here, like irony, for me, irony has become really dangerous because it's also a way to not have a position. And this, Steve Bannon's favorite film is Koyaanisqatsi, which is this like Godfrey Reggio. It's like one of the, like there was a trilogy. He's actually, the New Mexico guy's gone.
Oh yeah, he had to leave,
like Godfrey Reggio lived in New Mexico and produced 3 really luscious, like 35 millimeter, actually totally expensive and environmentally unsound films about environment. And they're really kind of considered important for like messaging. So Steve Bannon these were like left-wing messaging about the environment in the world. Like, I think they would fit perfectly in with the Anthropocene stuff. But anyhow, Steve Bannon loves these films and teaches them in his propaganda classes, which I found out watching late night comedy. I don't remember if it was like which one, Daily Show, one of their little news guys went out and did an undercover thing and joined Steve Bannon's like citizen media stuff for right-wingos. It's like, you should just see that. You have to find it on YouTube or something because it's really interesting. So yeah, language with like, I'm doing experiments with writing and scripting, and it's like trying to figure out which language is appropriate. Even becoming, by the way, it's like becoming has this other thing, like just 2 days ago or 3 days ago, the Prince Andrew said about his friendship with Epstein, the kind of notorious child molester and whatever. He said it's unbecoming, because becoming has this other meaning, which means like it becomes you, which is that it suits you, it makes you better, which I kind of like this, like actually, and part of this thing is like becoming media is that it's like what media becomes somebody, what's appropriate to you. And language becomes very interesting because exactly for like the memification of ideas, which I think through social media like Facebook chats or Instagram, the way that like some very smart people start to act like that would be serious communication. And I find it like I will use those tools, but I cannot believe in them as something more. And this kind of how you imagine memes working and how quickly they can be adapted by something else. I have to say, I find it very challenging. And I work across, like I work with whatever artists and theorists and so on, and also from different places. Even in meetings, I'm a Bach fellow now in Utrecht. I'm very proud. I was with 10 people. Yeah, it's great. It's like I actually have a job doing what I like to do with people I like. So it's the opposite of a job, but it's a fellowship. I guess it's what makes it not a job. But for example, having a vocabulary, and that because people use a lot of terminology, and I think it's useful to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing, or that like what are the terms that are kind of contested within our little sphere. And I think that's very useful because it's nice. And then actually I think it's nice to have one's own codes, like the coded language. So
but you are in Berlin, you are part of, everybody. I mean, you are extremely active, and you meet all these artists, all these people from different generations. You're crossing over, you're doing meetings, you're constantly active, you're constantly doing kind of initiatives that are not made for public consumption, but they are made for they're social situations. Yeah, they're meeting like a Stammtisch. You have this Stammtisch. Yeah, can you quickly tell us about the Stammtisch? What is happening there? What kind of people are there?
Totally welcome to join every Tuesday. It's actually at like Buchhandlung, Cafe Bar Buchhandlung, which is in Tucholsky-Straße, just around the corner from Kunstwerk. They've always been there. Like Telekommunisten is a loose affiliation. Dimitri Kleiner, Baruch Gottlieb, Franziska Kleiner. I'm like a cousin, so I'm in the family, but I don't really do deep projects with them. It's not so much officially a Telekommunisten Stammtisch, but sort of unofficially. We're the hosts, and like I'm a sort of secondary host, but I mean it's not with it's not really hierarchy. It's just we hang out, drink, and it's like hacker, artists, politically engaged people. Some a lot of it used to be unique in that it was a place where expats met. Now it's like we used to say like English is spoken there. Like on a road, it's a kind of mix of people, some nice, some awful. Like. I won't. This I would not like to say in public, just because we've had some issues with certain like well-known like people that were outed as being sexual predators. So how we deal with that and so on. And
we can deduce that.
But it's like in general, those things have kind of slowed down. I mean, Julian Assange was like his friends were there, so like there's a lot of paranoid freaks as well. So,
obviously, yeah.
But it's also just a place to hang out and meet up. And these are the places. Like at least Berlin is a very good place to have interesting informal conversations. And so when I talk about drinking, I do drink, but I also have a lot of useful and valuable conversations with people. And the
intersections that happen there are amazing. I mean, I remember that's why Liz likes to go to Berlin, because kind of networks and layers within these networks that are intersecting at these weird places like the Telekommunisten Stammtisch or in these CCC areas or whatever it is, and create a lot of informal power in a way. It's extremely powerful. It's it's not 6 points of connection to Julian Assange. It's one dot, or you even know him personally, or the other people, and all these kind of people are drifting in and out. So Berlin is a perfect place to be. I have a last question because we want to finish the podcast now, but we can't do the podcast with you without talking quickly about Reboot.
Okay.
Can you tell us what you have such a long history with radio? why the hell you doing radio? What is radio? I don't understand what radio is.
Okay. This thanks. I'm pretty good at wrapping this up. One thing is that
I'm sure
it's like, and it's one thing is after like sort of the big net time years, and after Pitt gave up moderation, and we sort of like that sort of got busy with Berlin. We did a thing called micro lounges, and that was also after a hybrid workspace documenta. And it's like really like a lot of success, but nothing in the hand, no money, can't pay the rent. So anyway, started small local initiatives, but also kind of wanted to do something that could connect all of these different social scenes that we were engaging with. So we had this space called Boot Lab, which was kind of a hacker space, like early hacker. We called them independent media labs, but and it was a good place to start a bigger project. So we started Reboot FM. We got a lot of money because remember we had an EU grant and then we had a Kulturstiftung grant. So it's like that's something that we had enough money to really do a lot of preparation, a lot of outreach, software development, do a 3-month radio broadcast. So we had really good conditions for realizing a massive project. We did a really good software, but the other important thing is we spent a lot of time asking different DJ collectives, political groups, artist groups, institutions, like high and low, what it would take for them to be involved with such a radio, like what it would take for them to want to listen or participate. And this, in that case, I think that's a very feminist practice, like going out and asking all these people. So doing outreach, but getting them engaged with the whole thing. And that is the first thing is we built up a really good social fabric. And the whole idea of the radio is to reflect the social fabric of Berlin. And that, we spent, 3 months just talking to people about what they would want. And that work has paid off until today. So the really long relationships that we have with organizations and people, it's changing. But some groups will bring in new people. So it's sort of has its own life. And it's always expanding. And it's very inclusive. It's like East Germans, West Germans, every kind of variation of gay, queer, that's out there. Old people, we don't, young people. So it's really black, white, East German, black people or Afro-German groups or people that don't deal with identity at all, just do their thing. It's over half of the radio makers are women. And we do award-winning experimental radio. So that's the thing is that nobody's included there for who they are. They're all included for what they do. If somebody deals with who they are and what they do, that's their business. And we also do, people are invited for that. But it's really just this thing. And I think we also we spend a lot of time developing program flows, so horizontal and vertical flows. We now have a license that we share with Kashmir Radio. We Are Born Free Empowerment Radio, which is a kind of refugee collective. Kashmir is a group of mostly electronic music people, but doing electronic culture. Giacomo and Filippo is part of Transmediale. Super lovely, savvy contemporary. And then another a electronic music collective, which is currently renaming itself Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays. And we had to really fight for this license for many years. But it's everybody has their own way of doing things. And I can say it's nice, it's interesting. Taxi drivers listen to it. So we have, and it's all over all these years, we have a really good team. And that's Pitt Schultz, Guido Plonsky, and I founded that. Mm-hmm. And we are still the team that more or less runs it. And then Naomi Cairon is part of the team. She's our studio freak. Everyone gets to choose their own title because if it doesn't pay, it's well. And then we have about 130 artists that make shows on a monthly basis, more or less monthly basis, mostly in different groups and constellations. So, and for one thing is we really encourage people to figure out how they make radio and not how they should make radio. And that's where I think this whole thing is figuring out their form and their content, how that works for them. And if it works for them, it's probably going to be okay for the public. And that's if we take everyone as reasonably interesting, good at what they do, then they will, if it's interesting. And the main thing is that they should have fun with it. They're not getting paid, so they ought to be able to enjoy it and have it be a reflection of what they think is important. And that seems to be a working model. So
great.
And I'm very proud of it, but I'm also the radio makers themselves, they're just cool people. They're all nice. They're all lovely, people to deal with, and they do cool stuff. And it's so fun if sometimes if I'm in a taxi and I make the taxi driver listen, if I'm in a taxi, that's going to happen. And it's like, oh, wow, it's really good. So, and it's not my work, it's their work, but it's my work to make their work hearable there. But it's really fun. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Diana, thank you so much for being here with us. Thanks for being part of this episode of the Octopus podcast in front of a live audience at the KHM, Academy of Media Arts, produced by the Black Mirror Institute.